family, after this war, I'll go to church every Sunday. That's a contract. And he didn't keep his part of it. And he came to me and he said, can you have a second bite at the cherry? Or a second chance? And I said, yes, you can, but not on that basis. You can't make a bargain with God. And there's a very simple reason why you can't have a contract with God, and that is that you've got nothing that he wants. You've got nothing that he needs. One of my favorite texts is in Psalm 50, where God says, if I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I love that text. I've never heard a preacher preach on it. You probably know the next verse, which says, the silver and the gold are mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. God is saying there, everything you've got is already mine. And it is. All the wealth in the world belongs to God, even if we think it belongs to us. It's his, and he could give it and take it away just like that. And the cattle on 1,000 hills. So God says, if I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you. Now it's amazing how many people try and make a bargain with God, as if they're in a position to. Jacob was a classic case. Do you remember when he dreamt the ladder reaching to heaven? The night he'd run away from home, fled from his brother Esau, whom he'd cheated. And he was homesick already. And he said to God, God, if you get me back to my father's house safely, I'll give you 1/10 of all that I get. A tithe, it was. You know, that didn't establish his relationship with God, because you can't bargain with God like that. Years later, Jacob was on his way home again, rather dreading meeting his brother Esau. And he was so scared he wanted God to bless him. And the night before he met Esau, he wrestled with God and said, I will not let you go until you bless me. Still trying to bargain. And God had to break that man, and he dislocated his hip. And from then on, Jacob walked with a limp. He was a broken man, but now God could use him. Now he realized his weakness. He wasn't going to bargain with God anymore. He was just going to surrender to God. And Jacob became Israel, the prince of Israel. Jacob was a man who tried to bargain, and still people today try to bargain. Lord, if you'll heal me, I'll devote the rest of my life to you. Lord, if you'll take this cancer away, I'll give money to missionaries. And you know, even some preachers encourage this by telling you, you give money to the Lord and he'll bless your business. That's bargaining with God. There is nothing you have that God needs. So you're not in a position to bargain. What you can do is have a covenant with him. But he will decide the terms, he will make the promises, and all you've got to do is say yes or no. Now, some covenants are what we call unconditional. And that means that even if the other party breaks their promises, the covenant will still stand. The person has bound themselves under an obligation which they cannot break or get out of. But some are conditional, and they look a little more like a contract because God said that. However, he has still settled the terms. It's still a unilateral bond. A covenant. So whenever you read about a covenant in the Bible, you have to begin by asking, is this unconditional or conditional? Then I was saying that God, amazingly, is a covenant-making God. That the maker of the entire universe should put himself voluntarily under obligation to any of us. is almost unthinkable, but that's what he's done. And he has therefore married people. One of the questions we asked earlier was, is marriage a covenant or a contract? And the sad truth is that it used to be a covenant, and God says it should be a covenant, but in modern society it's become a contract. And that's why there are so many divorces and remarriages around, even, alas, among Christians who should know better. A covenant marriage stays together because it's promised for better or worse. And however worse it gets, you've made a covenant promise and you will keep to it. One of the loveliest words in the Hebrew language is a word called chesed. And it means love or loving kindness. It's translated in different ways, but essentially it means covenant love. And it's better, I think, translated loyalty. Staying with it, having made a promise, keeping to it. And I told them about that, a man in the north of England whose wife, shortly after their marriage, got into very bad ways, became unfaithful, left him, lived on the streets, contracted disease. And his friend said, why don't you divorce her? She's no use to you. You're left with the kids and she doesn't care. Divorce her and find a decent woman to be your wife who'll look after you and your kids. And he said, never speak to me like that about my wife. She's my wife and I shall love her as long as there's breath in her body. And he did. And she died shortly afterwards with his hands spread over her in love and prayer. That's covenant love. But today, contract love, unfortunately. And even married couples are deciding before they get married how they'll split the money and the property when they get divorced. Would you believe it? People talking about divorce before they even make any promises. And of course we are now into the situation where people are living together without any promises, without any commitment. And statistically the chances of that kind of a relationship lasting are far poorer than those who've made a promise and a commitment in front of witnesses. Well, that was marriage. So we looked for another example from daily life of a covenant. And since the word covenant is the same as the word testament, another example from daily life, which we all know, is when you make a will. And we call it the last will and testament. And you decide where your money and property goes. You decide who your heirs are. And it's a voluntary obligation on your part towards them. It's not a bargain with them. It is a promise to them. While you're alive, you can change your will by adding codicils or writing a new will. But the moment you're dead, that moment the covenant is fixed and must come into operation. And I mentioned the interesting point in the letter to the Hebrews that the new covenant we talk about doesn't come into operation until Jesus died. And that's why on the last night of his life he said, this is my blood of the new covenant. 24 hours later, the new covenant was in operation because Jesus had died and left us in his will and testament. We are heirs of God because God has made testament in our favor, his will and testament expressed in covenants. And then we said that we must ask two questions. How many covenants are there in the Bible? And here Christians are very divided. Some say 1, 2, 3, 5, 7. You'll find all those theories in books about the Bible. I'm being honest when I say I believe there are 5. And I'm teaching you about those 5 covenants today. But then we have to ask another question. How many of these covenants affect me as a Christian? All 5? Or just 1?